What's up, everybody? Dr. Seagren here. And I think the course so far, in terms of the lecture materials, have kind of followed a general pattern, talking about the history of Earth, talking about the chemistry of Earth, talking about the physics of Earth, talking about the biology of Earth. This is going to be kind of an abrupt change. I had mentioned that we'll be talking more about humans previously, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So our new subject material doesn't really have anything to do with biology or evolution or disease or biodiversity or any of that stuff. It's going to be kind of a hard stop, and we are going to begin talking about natural resources and the consequences of using them. That's going to be broadly the next several months of content. So with that in mind, we're going to start with our first natural resource today, and that's going to be something called fossil fuels. So I'm going to explain what those are, where they come from, how we use them, and what the consequences of those are. Let's get into it. All right, so here we are, fossil fuels. Before we get into what a fossil fuel is, let's talk some about what natural resources are in general and some other vocabulary that we will reference to when we talk about other natural resources. So a natural resource is basically anything that humans use or consume. Some examples of things that you use or consume would be like things like water and food. Those are basics, very necessary things for us to have. But other things like wood, land, metal ore, energy, all the stuff that you use in your day-to-day life can be considered a natural resource. And human history, if we're going to summarize it scientifically, it can basically be summarized by what resources humans are using and how efficiently they're using them. So for example, in this first picture, we see some cavemen hunting some deer. And you can see they're using some resources, and in the bottom picture, it looks more like modern day, where we have cities, planes, trains, automobiles, all kinds of stuff. We're all going about our life. It's a very different lifestyle nowadays compared to the cavemen. And when you ask yourself, okay, so what's different about our lives now compared to the caveman days? Basically, it all comes down to what resources are we using? And what kinds of technologies have we developed around those resources? So you combine those two things and it basically results in a progressing, more prosperous humanity overall. I think we would rather live in our modern comforts than have to go chase deer around all day, every day. Now, the kind of crazy thing to think about is that nothing has fundamentally changed about the Earth since the time of the cavemen to modern day. For example, in the time of the cavemen might have seen a rock that looks like this. And if I hold it up to the camera very closely here with some light, you can see all the little sparkles. Hopefully those come through. What those sparkles are actually iron. That is metal in the rock. This rock is actually quite heavy because of all this iron, and we would consider this rock an iron ore. These rocks existed in the times of the cavemen. Maybe even some cavemen saw them and thought they were cool, but they didn't realize that if you heat this rock up, you can actually melt all of that iron out, and then we can make things like steel out of it. So if you dropped modern humans, modern scientists, modern engineers back into the caveman world, they could make a skyscraper, and the cavemen could have made a skyscraper too. The only difference between us now and the cavemen is knowledge, and specifically knowledge of how to use the resources around us. So generally speaking, what we could summarize for, if we wanted to kind of summarize humanity in a very simple equation, the idea is that over time we figured out more resources could be harnessed by us. So we found more and more resources as we sort of explored our world more and more. And as also we kind of developed as humanity, we realized that there were better and better ways to use said resources. So over time, basically our resources that we can use have been increasing, and the technology that we have developed on how to use those resources has also been increasing, and a combination of those two things has basically increased our overall prosperity. What we will cover later is that will there be a point in human history where I assume that we can always develop more and more technology, but will there be a point where we basically run out of resources to consume? And what does that mean for our overall prosperity? So we'll kind of table that conversation for a later lecture, probably a couple lectures from now. We'll talk a little bit more about resources and economics. But I just wanted to get you guys kind of thinking about that subject, priming your brains for it. Energy resources are among the most important for humans. As a refresher from last semester, energy is the ability to do work, or essentially to make something move. And basically we need, as humans, we need lots of energy because we are constantly needing to move lots of things. We need to move cars and boats and planes and trains and all of our food and other resources. Even things like electricity that your computer is running off of, or your phone, whatever you're watching this off of now, is dependent on electrons moving in wires, and there needs to be energy behind that movement. So amongst our most important, I would say, our actual most important resources come down to energy. Everything in this picture here is impossible without energy resources. So they're super important. And when we talk about energy resources, we consider them to fall into two categories: renewable and non-renewable. These are probably words that you're familiar with from previous science classes. Whether a resource is renewable versus non-renewable depends on the rate of consumption compared to the rate of replenishment. Most things in the natural world will replenish themselves over time, and I'll give some examples of that momentarily, but also we are using, burning, eating, whatever, those same resources. And so if we're consuming it faster than it's going to come back, then that means it's going to be non-renewable. And if we're consuming it slower than it will come back, that will be renewable. And what this means is that renewable resources won't deplete over time, non-renewable will deplete over time. Or in other words, they will run out. Okay, let's go over some examples. Something that won't ever really run out over time is something like the sun. We can set out solar panels, and we are pretty confident that we're not going to run out of sunlight anytime soon here on Earth. The sun eventually might burn out some billions of years from now, but that's a long way off. I have utmost confidence that the sun will rise tomorrow. On the other hand, something like oil, which we're going to talk about more today, oil is that black stuff that comes out of the ground. We pump it out. We use it in our cars. We use it in a variety of different ways. And there is a limited amount. There's like a pocket of oil down here underground. And as we're pumping it out, it gets lower and lower and lower. And eventually, it's going to completely run out. So that would be an example of a non-renewable resource. We are pumping it out of the ground and burning it faster than the Earth can basically remake it. Again, this concept is going to kind of tie into this equation later on. What happens is certain resources begin running out. Can technology kind of make up the gap that is created by the lack of resources as humans kind of grow and grow and grow? And what does that mean for our lives, which is basically our prosperity? It'll be an interesting conversation. So the energy resources that we are going to discuss as part of this class are listed here. We have divided by non-renewables and renewables. And as a reminder, non-renewables are things that are going to run out. Those are our fossil fuels, which we're going to talk about the rest of this video. Uranium, which is used in nuclear energy. We'll explain it when we get to that one. Then we have our renewable energy resources, such as the sun, which I already mentioned. The sun is not going to run out anytime soon. Things like wood and what we would consider biofuel. Can we run out of wood in the world? Technically, yes, but wood basically forms as plants grow and they require sunlight, and the sunlight's not going to run out. So conceivably, wood will never completely run out. However, you can imagine cutting down a forest and burning all the wood, and it's going to take some time for that forest to regrow itself. So technically, you could imagine a world in which we burn or cut down wood faster than it can grow back, in which case that would be more like a non-renewable resource. But assuming that we're not doing that and we're letting the wood grow back, wood is never going to run out. Same with wind and water. Those are processes that are driven by the sun. Let's tackle wind first. Last semester, we learned that as you heat up a fluid or a gas, it tends to expand and rise, and as it cools off, it sinks. This is the main driver of the wind. So air in a certain part of the world gets heated up, it expands, it moves to another part of the world. Air in another part of the world cools off, moves around. That's what drives the wind currents, and that's all driven by the sun. The reason why this air is heating up and cooling down is all driven by the sun. And so it's never not going to be windy on Earth, not anytime soon. The same with water, and we'll talk more about this later, but we can harness the energy of rivers, and that energy ultimately comes from rain. So the reason rivers are flowing is because it was raining. The water is working its way down to the rivers and down to the ocean, part of the water cycle. But the thing that's driving that entire water cycle is the sun. We can also harness energy from the earth. We call that geothermal energy, the energy of volcanoes and all that heat that's deep down underneath us. We can harness that for energy as well. It's a bit tricky to do, but we can do it, and that energy is not going to run out anytime soon. And also the tides. Very rarely, there are some scientists working on ways to generate electricity from the tidal movements. I'll talk more about that later, but the energy of the tides are not going to run out anytime soon either. Believe it or not, it's a bit complicated to answer where ultimately that energy comes from in the tides, so I'm not even going to go there. But those are basically our energy resources that we have available on Earth. So let's tackle that first one today. What is a fossil fuel? Right in the name should kind of give you a clue of what it is. A fossil is kind of like a dead thing underground, right? And a fuel is something that we can burn. So if you put it together, it's basically a dead thing buried underground that we can burn. And yeah, the energy resource that forms very slowly over a long time from dead organisms. We'll talk about how that works and how that process occurs. Some examples that you might have heard of are things like coal. Talk about what that is in a second. Crude oil, that is the black stuff that's pumped out of the ground, as well as natural gas. If you have a gas heater, hot water heater, or maybe a gas stove or a gas grill at home, that also comes from underground. And of course, how do we use this stuff? We can use it to make electricity, we can use it for transportation, and we can use it for cooking and heating as well. So let's get into some specifics. Let's start with coal. What how does coal form and what exactly is it? Coal forms underneath prehistoric swamps. So here we have a picture. This is what we think Earth looked like some 300 to 400 million years ago. And we can see it's kind of a swampy environment. We can see a lot of pine trees and ferns. We can see some little frog lizard monster looking things here. And how coal forms is that basically right here, we can see that there is a tree that's fallen over and it's kind of sinking down into the mud. And if we went down deep into this swamp and went underneath the water and underneath the mud, what we would find is basically a mixture of old rotting trees and mud. And over time, if we're kind of thinking geologically speaking, what we're going to find is that these old trees and mud are going to get pushed down, and new mud is constantly going to be layered on top of it, pushing down the old one, layering on top of it, and so on and so forth. And this mixture of basically mud and vegetation, dead trees and leaves and all that stuff, gets partially cooked by the earth until it looks like this. It's kind of half charcoal, half rock would be a good way to describe it. But it's also good to distinguish that this is not charcoal. Coal is not charcoal. Charcoal is what you burn in your barbecue. That's just wood chips, basically, burnt wood chips. Coal is a actual rock, and it's a mixture. It's partially made of wood, but it's made of other things as well. How long does it take to make? Most coal in the United States is about 300 million years old. It probably doesn't quite take always 300 million years to generate coal, but it's probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, to really form coal underneath a swamp. And for this reason, we can see that it is non-renewable. We dig it up and burn it a lot faster than it's created by the earth. There is a lot of coal left in the earth, so even at our current rate of burning it, there's still hundreds of years left of it. But that is a bit of a complicated topic, which we will explore later. What do we do with coal? So we dig it up out of the ground and burn it. Was it just for fun? No. We burn coal to make electricity. We will reference electricity a lot here in the next few lectures. Electricity is just current flowing through a wire, and generally how you make electricity is with something called a generator. Put simply, a generator works if you can make something spin. If you can actually spin just a magnet inside of a coil of wire, you can make electricity. So that means that if you can get something to spin, you can make electricity. I have a little hand crank demo here. This thing is a little bit temperamental. I fixed it a while back, but now it sometimes doesn't work. So let's see if I can make this spin and create electricity here. So you can see that all I had to do is spin. There's a magnet in here. There's a coil of wire. As the magnet spins inside the coil of wire, it makes electricity. This used to work a lot better. Some of the parts are falling apart inside. Okay, so you can make electricity if you can make something spin. How can we burn coal and make something spin? The idea is that as you burn coal, you use it to heat water. As you heat water, there's a tendency to create steam and for the steam to rise. As the steam is rising, you use something that kind of looks like a windmill or a turbine or a boat propeller kind of looking thing. Basically, as the steam rises, it kind of spins this fan apparatus, and you connect that to a magnet and a coil of wire, bam, you got electricity. So that's something we call a generator or a power plant. And all the electricity that you're using now has to come from generally speaking, something spinning in the world. So something somewhere is spinning right now to generate the electricity in your computer, your house, your home, etc., etc. And about 35 to 40% of all electricity in the world comes from burning coal. And that has been a number that's held steady for about 30 years. That was the data I was just looking at. The amount of electricity being made from coal in America is decreasing, but the amount of electricity being made from coal in places like China and India has been increasing. And that kind of washes for the entire globe. So a lot of electricity still in the world comes from coal. It's also used in steel production. I mentioned that to get the metal out of a rock, you need really, really high temperatures. So you need to basically kind of melt it. And coal typically burns higher at a higher temperature than wood. So we need coal to make things like steel as well. It just so happens that some of you might actually live near one of the larger coal plants in the United States. Westbury is around here, and if you drive out 59 down to Sugar Land, past Missouri City and Sugar Land, there is a big lake, and there is something called the W.A. Parish plant. This is what it looks like from the highway, this picture over here, and this is a coal power plant. That's what it does. It basically burns coal all day. And on the railroad tracks heading out there, you may see this sometimes, which is basically just train car full of coal. And that all gets shipped to the power plant. The power plant burns it. And in the process, that makes electricity for Houston. Every day, that coal plant burns about 350 train car full loads of coal per day. And luckily for us here in Houston, most of the smoke that's made from burning all that coal is actually pumped underground in not really a cave. It's basically an old oil well. So kind of think of it like a rock with a bunch of cracks in it. That's what we do with all the smoke. Pretty kind of strange, but at least I don't have to breathe it. All right. So that covers coal for the most part. We haven't talked much about environmental issues associated with coal. We'll do that once we get to the end of this PowerPoint. But oil and gas is something else that we use a lot in the world. And when we say oil and gas, we mean two separate things. We have something called crude oil, which is kind of this mixture of gases, liquids, and waxy tars and all kinds of stuff. And we make all sorts of stuff out of crude oil. Gasoline is made from crude oil, so is plastic and tar. We'll go into some more detail of what else you can make with it. And then usually where you find crude oil in the world, underground, you also will find gas. And that isn't gasoline, that's natural gas. Basically, it's little pockets of gas, things like methane and propane that are underground, trapped in the rocks. And generally where you find one, you find the other. And the gas stuff we actually use mainly for electricity and heating. And if you've ever gone to the store and you've seen these propane tanks, that is the gas that is usually kind of stored with this black oily stuff. That's all kind of together underground. So how does oil and natural gas form? Instead of forming underneath a swamp like coal, these typically are formed underneath shallow oceans and seas. And how this works is basically in the ocean, we know we have lots of little algae and microscopic creatures all floating around in the water column. All this green stuff you can see here in the picture. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of this stuff, there's a high turnover rate. It is constantly kind of growing and dying and growing and dying. And when it dies, it kind of makes its way down to the bottom of the ocean. And similar to coal, basically, we will have these layers of mud and then a layer of algae, and then a layer of mud, and then a layer of algae, and a layer of mud, etc., all kind of getting mixed together. And as it's stacking on top of itself, it's kind of pushing the layers down, 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 deeper into the earth. And as it gets deeper into the earth, it's starting to get hotter and hotter, closer to that lava and magma. And this algae plankton combination is actually getting cooked and will begin working its way as it's getting cooked and kind of mushified. It begins working its way back up to the surface. And typically speaking, what happens is it kind of gets trapped by what's called a cap rock. So some kind of rock blocks it from actually making it all the way to the surface as it's kind of bubbling up. And underneath that rock will basically be a big oil reserve. So you'll have a big pocket of oil forming underneath certain rocks. The oil that you might see moving around and being pumped out of the Gulf of Mexico off of the coast of Texas is around 100 million years old. And again, the time frame for Earth to make oil is going to be in the hundreds of thousands or millions of years. So when we tap into it, pump it out, and burn it, it's pretty much gone. It's not coming back anytime soon. All right, so what do we use oil and gas for? Oil and natural gas, I should say. Oil is mainly used to make fuel like gasoline and jet fuel. Unbelievable amounts of gasoline are burned each year around the world, and so we need absurd amounts of oil to kind of keep everything running in the world. And natural gas is mainly used in electricity, cooking, and heating. About 25% of electricity in the world comes from natural gas. And kind of surprisingly, we mentioned that crude oil was a mixture of a lot of different substances. One of those substances happens to be gasoline. And we can separate out all this mixture into its different components. And we find that basically some components are really good for fuel, like gasoline, but then the leftovers are kind of this tarry stuff. They kind of look like, if you've ever seen those cracks on the road in the pavement, or if you've ever seen anybody put that layer down on top of a roof before, you ever watched a roofer work, that kind of waxy, tarry stuff can be modified to make plastic. So if you think about all the things in the world that depend on plastic and tar, yeah, it's a lot. So we use oil for so much, not only do we use it in our cars and gasoline as a fuel, but we also use all these leftover products as a way to make all kinds of different things that we depend on. And you might be asking yourself, okay, how could you possibly make plastic out of oil? That doesn't make any sense. The process is called refining. If you've ever driven, if you live in Houston, if you've ever driven by the Ship Channel or by Pasadena, you see all this stuff and you're like, what the heck is going on over there? There are all these pipes and smoke and things burning all the time. What they are doing is refining oil. So how it works is that if you heat up oil in a furnace, so here we have our oil and we're heating it up, what happens is that it basically will separate out. Some things will kind of evaporate and you can collect them. Usually all those things that evaporate tend to be things like natural gas, propane and butane, other things like that, kerosene, and also diesel and gasoline. And then everything that's kind of left over at the bottom that doesn't really evaporate, all the kind of heavy tar stuff, that is known as asphalt. And actually the thing that makes plastics, I think, is this weird naphtha stuff. So one of the middle products, not one of the heavier tars, but you can kind of see the idea of all of these different types of chemicals separating out that can be modified further into different products. All right, now let's talk about some of their overall environmental problems. We'll talk about some specific problems of both coal and specific problems for oil. and then we'll talk about kind of more general problems for both of them. And kind of starting with some of the most minimal problems associated with these fossil fuels, something called coal ash is basically the leftovers. If you've ever cooked with charcoal or something, you know that after you burn all your charcoal, you kind of have all this stuff left over at the bottom of your grill. Same thing kind of happens with coal. When you burn coal in a power plant, you have this kind of leftover material, and unfortunately, it can be toxic, and usually it has heavy metals in it. And the only solution on what to do with this stuff is to just kind of put it in a big pile. It's called a coal ash pond. So you just sort of keep it up next to your power plant, and as rain hits this coal ash, which can carry toxins, some of these toxins basically work their way into things like groundwater or into rivers, and makes it hazardous to drink that water and contributes to water pollution. Also, as you burn all this coal and some of this stuff, all this smoke goes into the air, some of these chemicals in the smoke of coal can mix with rain, producing acid rain that is much stronger than typical rain would be. Just to kind of give you some perspective, this is our coal power plant in Houston, and here's your coal plant, and you're burning all your stuff and you're making electricity, and that's cool. But then over here off to the side is your giant pile of leftover waste, which is your coal ash. Put it on the side, and you can actually see this coal ash from space. This big black pile that's quite large actually is your giant pile of coal ash from that power plant, and they have completely, this is the power plant here. This whole area is completely blocked off, and they do not let you go fishing in this lake because this lake is heavily contaminated by our friend the coal ash. So there's no fishing in Smithers Lake unless you want to jump a fence and potentially get arrested. All right, so that's some of the unique environmental issues of coal and coal ash. There are also some unique environmental issues with oil. Oil is a resource that unfortunately is not everywhere in the world, but everywhere in the world needs oil to basically run their economy. For example, you might, a place like France. France is a pretty nice place to live. It has, it's very well developed and all that stuff, but France has essentially zero oil, which means that for France to have all of its cars running and its factories running and plastic and all that other stuff, they need to buy oil and have it shipped to them to make all this stuff run. And typically how we move oil around the world is with something called an oil tanker. It's basically a big boat that holds a whole bunch of oil. And if you ever have sat around the ship channel of Galveston or the Intercoastal Waterway, you can see these things just going by every day, carrying oil down to different refineries around the Texas coast. And unfortunately, every once in a while, these things will crash, and all of this oil will go spilling out into the water. And when that happens, oil generally is not the best for creatures to be able to kind of survive in. And we've had numerous disasters around the world of oil spills where this kind of sludgy, nasty stuff goes spilling out in the ocean and kills things. And then some more environmental issues. This is the mother of all environmental issues, global warming. We've touched on it before. We are going to discuss it ad nauseum soon. When you burn any kind of fossil fuel, when you burn anything, it releases carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat. As more and more carbon dioxide goes up into the air and into the atmosphere, the more heat Earth traps from the sun, and the hotter it gets. That is causing all kinds of issues all over the world on a variety of different fronts. There's no way I can go into it all now, but it's bad. And last but not least, of course, if you live in a city, you've ever smelled car exhaust before, doesn't smell great. And generally, people that live in the city have higher rates of asthma and lung cancer, emphysema, those sorts of things because of all the smoke released from burning fossil fuels. All right, so that wraps up. Hopefully you feel like, okay, yeah, I know what fossil fuels are. I know how we use them. I know where they come from. I know the problems associated with them. Our next lecture will be about the renewable and other alternative kinds of energy. We didn't go into too much today about how much of our world really depends on fossil fuels. You can kind of see some details about how most of our electricity comes from either coal or natural gas. But 40% from coal, 25% from natural gas. You can see that's up to 65%-ish of all of the global electricity comes from either coal or natural gas. And pretty much 100% of transportation, so cars, planes, boats, trains, all that stuff comes from oil. So it's safe to say that the world is heavily dependent currently on fossil fuels, and the next several videos will be about, okay, can we, these things are not exactly great. I mean, you can see the environmental issues there. Global warming is a really bad one. So not only are they not good for the environment, but remember at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about how they're non-renewable. So at some point, we're going to run out of them, and we need to be able to do something else instead of using fossil fuels. And what that something else will be, we'll talk about. So that's it for right now. Have a great day. See you guys later.